Howdy do, and welcome back. This is part two of a two-part series on Langston Hughes. Now, if you didn't listen to the first part, get out of here and go listen to it. You're going to be very confused if you don't. Part one also covers why a white nerd like me is covering a black poet like Langston Hughes. In certain parts of social media, I told you that part two would not be a dream deferred, which I've realized since I did that we didn't cover that in part one, and I wasn't planning on covering it in part two. So we're going to correct that before we begin. A dream deferred is perhaps the phrase most associated with Langston Hughes. It comes from a 1951 work called Montage of a Dream Deferred, which is either one long poem or 91 individual poems, depending on how you look at it. The most famous of those 91 individual poems is titled Harlem. Harlem reads, quote, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" Unquote. The play A Raisin in the Sun gets its name from the poem, not the other way around. Now that we've resolved this glaring omission, let's get back into it. But first, some Bach. We left off last time with Langston Hughes returning from his European adventure and moving in with his upper society cousins, who were also housing his mother and younger brother. Langston, in contrast to his high society relatives, gets a job at a laundromat that catered almost exclusively to working class people, meaning the clothes always stunk, and they stunk bad. The educated black society of Washington, D.C. didn't think that a poet of Langston's status should be working at a laundromat. But they also never offered him any better work. Around this time, Langston decides he wants to return to college. And as a reminder from part one, all quotes are from Langston Hughes' autobiography, The Big C. Quote, "I spoke with Dean Kelly Miller at Howard University about the possibility of trying for a scholarship at the college. And he spoke grandiloquently about my granduncle who had been the first dean of the Howard Law School, and what a fine man he was, but it seems that there were no scholarships forthcoming. I spoke with Dr. Elaine Locke, who said my poems were about to appear in the new Negro issue of the Survey Graphic, and who declared I was the most racial of the new Negro poets. But he didn't have any scholarships up his sleeve either. So I began to try and save $1 a week towards entering college. But if you ever started out with nothing, maybe you know how hard it is to work up even to an overcoat. I wanted to return to college mostly in order to get a better background for writing and for understanding the world. I wanted to study sociology and history and psychology and find out why countries and people were the kind of countries and people they are." Unquote. After a while, his mother decided that her, Langston, and his brother should leave the cousin's house. They had insulted her in some way or another, so they had to go. Langston and his mother worked to support each other and Langston's brother Kit. Langston's already suffering finances didn't improve from having to pay rent now. While in Washington, Langston writes a lot of poems because he's miserable. Part of his misery comes from his exclusion on all sides of society. Discussing segregation, he wrote, quote, "In Europe and in Mexico I have lived with white people, worked and eaten and slept with white people, and no one seemed any the worse for it. In New York I have sat beside white people in theaters and movie houses, and neither they nor I appeared to suffer. But in Washington, I could not see a legitimate stage show because the theaters would not sell Negroes a ticket. I could not get a cup of coffee on a cold day anywhere within sight of the capital, because no white restaurant would serve a Negro. I could not see the new motion pictures because they did not play in Negro houses. Unquote. On the other side, the educated black community were too snobbish for his taste. He hates their class distinctions and their arrogance. However, he also recognized the fact that their snobbishness was coming more from a place of fear. They knew how precarious their own situation was, especially since most of them had poor and working class relatives, so they had to be twice as snobby to cover their own fears. To say nothing of the fact that after being crapped on by society for so long, when they got even slightly elevated, they assumed the behaviors they had observed. Around this time, Alain Locke's collection The New Negro was published, and a party was put on celebrating the writers featured in it. Langston was invited, as he was one of the writers, but told them he couldn't come because he didn't own a dinner coat. The people hosting the party said, "Come anyway and bring your mother." However, the day of, they uninvited his mother, feeling like it was too high class for her. As a result, neither Langston nor his mother attended. This became a theme. Quote, "Again, some months later, at the home of a prominent hostess at a supper for Roland Hayes after his first big Washington concert, I was placed near the end of the table. The lady next to me kept her back turned all the time, talking up the table in the direction of Mr. Hayes. A few days later, however, amusingly enough, I got a note from this lady saying she was extremely sorry she hadn't known she was sitting next to Langston Hughes, the poet, because we could have talked together." Unquote. During the natural course of working at the laundromat, Langston gets sick. He misses a week of work while he recovers. When he returns, he is told he doesn't have a job anymore. Nothing more American than getting sick and losing your job for it. Needing new work, he gets a job at the local newspaper, but quits after 2 weeks, unhappy at his pay. Then he gets a job with Dr. Carter G. Woodson, working as Woodson's personal assistant. In terms of jobs a writer should have, to take a phrase from the snobby elites that Langston hated, this is probably the closest Langston has ever come. And Langston likes Woodson, he's paid well, and the work makes thematic sense. It's almost perfect. However, there's an issue. Langston doesn't like the work. It's a lot of alphabetizing and reading, and it hurts Langston's eyes. So he quits and gets a job as a busboy. As a busboy, he meets Vachel Lindsay, an American poet. Langston knows who he is, but he's too nervous to introduce himself. Instead, he slips Lindsay some of his poems while he's bussing the table. To Langston's surprise, Lindsay likes the poems and writes about Langston in a newspaper article, giving Langston a bit of publicity as the busboy poet. Riding this high, Langston submits his poem, The Weary Blues, to a contest in Opportunity magazine. Langston wins first prize. At the award ceremony, Langston meets Carl Van Vechten. They had previously met at the NAACP party Langston attended upon re-arriving in America. Vechten asks him if he has enough poems for a book yet. Langston sends his best poems to Vechten, who passes them off to publisher Alfred A. Knopf, who accepts them. Thus, the book of poems, The Weary Blues, is born. In the meantime, Langston leaves his job as a busboy and starts working at an oyster house serving oysters. After winning the prize from Opportunity magazine and his rising fame after being included in Locke's The New Negro, Langston starts to meet the other poets of Washington, D.C. While Langston hated most of his time in D.C., the poetry he wrote and the poets he met were the rare bright spots. Langston Hughes had always been influenced by music, especially jazz and blues. His first book of poetry being The Weary Blues wasn't a coincidence. However, he had to change his compositional process after a chance encounter with a stranger. Quote, "The blues poems I would often make up in my head and sing on the way to work, except that I could never carry a tune, but when I sing to myself, I think I am singing. One evening, I was crossing Rock Creek Bridge, singing a blues I was trying to get right before I put it down on paper. A man passing on the opposite side of the bridge stopped, looked at me, then turned around and cut across the roadway. He said, 'Son, what's the matter? Are you ill?' 'No,' I said, 'just singing.' 'I thought you were groaning,' he commented. 'Sorry,' and went on his way. So after that, I never sang my verses aloud in the street anymore." Unquote. Now, if that's not a mood, I don't know what is. Here, we're at an impasse. We're roughly at 1925. 1925 sees Langston re-enroll in college. During his college years, however, Langston was a popular man about town and a key figure of the Harlem Renaissance. I want to cover both experiences, but trying to weave the two together isn't going to work for me. Too many overlapping events and dates to keep straight. So we're going to compartmentalize. We'll cover some key parts of the Renaissance from Langston's perspective first, and then we'll rewind time and talk about his school adjacent stuff. Make sense? I hope so. First things first, the Harlem Renaissance. Let's define the scope, at least in Langston's eyes. Quote, "The 1920s were the years of Manhattan's Black Renaissance. It began with Shuffle Along, Running Wild, and the Charleston. Perhaps some people would say even with the Emperor Jones, Charles Gilpin, and the Tom Toms at Provincetown. But certainly it was the musical review Shuffle Along that gave a scintillating send-off to that Negro vogue in Manhattan, which reached its peak just before the crash of 1929, the crash that sent Negroes, white folks, and all rolling down the hill towards the Works Progress Administration. Shuffle Along was a honey of a show, swift, bright, funny, rollicking, and gay, with a dozen danceable, singable tunes. Besides, look who were in it. The now famous choir director Hall Johnson and the composer William Grant Still were a part of the orchestra. U.B. Blake and Noble Sissle wrote the music and played and acted in the show. Miller and Lyles were the comics. Florence Mills skyrocketed to fame in the second act. Trixie Smith sang 'He May Be Your Man, But He Comes to See Me Sometimes,' and Caterina Jarboro, now a European prima donna, and the internationally celebrated Josephine Baker were merely in the chorus. Everybody was in the audience, including me. People came back to see it innumerable times. It was always packed." Unquote. Now, I know we just started our conversation about the Harlem Renaissance, but I want to take a brief moment here to talk about a name Langston mentions, William Grant Still. We mentioned him briefly last time, and I said we'd get to him in part 2. Well, here we are. We're going to spend a bit talking about Still. William Grant Still was born in Mississippi, though he quickly moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. At the age of 15, he starts taking violin lessons, but would go on to teach himself the clarinet, saxophone, oboe, double bass, cello, and viola. He graduated as valedictorian from his high school in 1911. He attends Wilberforce University in Ohio to please his mother, who wanted him to go on to medical school. While there, Still joins a fraternity, conducts a band, and starts to compose. He would later leave Wilberforce, never acquiring his degree. Around that time, his father passed away and left him with a little money. He used the money to attend the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, also working for the school as a janitor to try and make tuition. When one of his professors asked him why he wasn't studying composition, Still responds simply that he cannot afford it. Because of this, his professors agree to tutor him in composition for free, seeing his obvious talent. He would leave the conservatory to join the Navy in World War I, and when he came back, he started playing in bands and orchestras in Harlem. In 1931, for the first time in history, a complete score of a work composed by an African American was performed by an orchestra. The orchestra in question was the Rochester Philharmonic, and the piece is known today as Symphony No. 1 Afro-American, though at the time it was just called the Afro-American Symphony. It's hard to name something number 1 if you don't know number 2 is coming. Much easier in hindsight when you know he'll go on to write 5 symphonies, to say nothing of the 4 ballets, 9 operas, and hundreds of other pieces. Still's Symphony No. 1 would go on to be one of, if not the most performed symphony composed by an American of any race at the time. He was also the first American of any race to have an opera produced by the New York City Opera, which is a little less impressive when you realize the opera company started during his lifetime, but still, the first American opera they picked to perform was by a black man. That's not a common thing. Still was also the first black man to conduct a major American symphony orchestra. And that's just about all I want to say about Still, except to say that I absolutely love that William Grant Still was so wildly successful in such a white European field. Because let's be honest, if you picture a composer of a symphony or a ballet or an opera, you're not picturing a black man. You're picturing a Renaissance-era European with a powdered wig. So to see Still not only do it, but do it well, is a wonderful thing. Back to Langston Hughes. We are now in the Harlem Renaissance, and Langston has some thoughts on the matter. The Big C, which is the piece I'm working from, was written in 1940, so it's after the fact, but Langston says that he predicted black art being in vogue simply wouldn't last. He knew that the Harlem Renaissance was just the latest fad, and mainstream America would find some other new thing to become fascinated with. Being in Harlem early on, Langston saw how black art was attracting more and more white people to Harlem, which felt unfair. White people could come to Harlem and attend black shows, but black people couldn't attend those shows at places like the Cotton Club in Harlem, despite the fact that the club was using exclusively black performers. He felt it was equally unfair that white people could come and watch black art in Harlem, but black people couldn't go watch white art, as white clubs wouldn't allow black patrons. He also criticizes the people who flooded to Harlem to see the art, but had no interest in seeing the true Harlem. And while the Harlem Renaissance is remembered today as an explosion of black art and culture, Langston hated that people at the time thought it would be some great bridging of the races. Langston, quite correctly, points out that the Harlem Renaissance did nothing for the average black person throughout America. Those working the fields in the South, for example, didn't suddenly get a nice pay bump because black art was popular in New York. And as black clubs became more and more popular, Langston started to prefer the more private social whist parties, which usually just involved people getting together with food, drinks, women, and music. 1926 sees Langston live in the same building as Wallace Thurman, editor of The Messenger. And when Langston writes his very first short stories later that year, The Messenger bought them up for $10 a pop. Langston then does what seemingly every other writer we've covered did. He starts a magazine that completely fails. I'll let him tell you about it. Quote, during the summer of 1926, Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, John P. Davis, Bruce Nugent, Gwendolyn Bennett and I decided to publish a Negro quarterly of the arts, to be called Fire. The idea being that it would burn up a lot of the old, dead, conventional Negro white ideas of the past, épater la bourgeoisie into a realization of the existence of the younger Negro writers and artists, and provide us with an outlet for publication not available in the limited pages of the small Negro magazines then existing, The Crisis, Opportunity, and The Messenger, the first two being house organs of interracial organizations, and the latter being God knows what. Sweltering summer evenings we met to plan Fire. Each of the seven of us agreed to give $50 to finance the first issue. Thurman was to edit it, John P. Davis to handle the business end, and Bruce Nugent to take charge of distribution. The rest of us were to serve as an editorial board to collect material, contribute our own work, and act in any useful way that we could. For artists and writers, we got along fine, and there were no quarrels. But October came before we were ready to go to press. I had to return to Lincoln, John Davis to law school at Harvard, Zora Hurston to her studies at Barnard, from whence she went about Harlem with an anthropologist's ruler measuring heads for Franz Boas. Only 3 of the 7 had contributed their $50, but the others faithfully promised to send theirs out of tuition checks, wages, or begging. Thurman went on with the work of preparing the magazine. He got a printer, he planned the layout. It had to be on good paper, he said, worthy of the drawings of Aaron Douglas. It had to have beautiful type, worthy of the first Negro art quarterly. It had to be what we 7 young Negroes dreamed our magazine would be. So in the end, it cost almost $1,000, and nobody could pay the bills. I don't know how Thurman persuaded the printer to let us have all the copies to distribute, but he did. I think Elaine Locke, among others, signed notes guaranteeing payments. But since Thurman was the only one of the 7 of us with a regular job, for the next 3 or 4 years his checks were constantly being attached and his income seized to pay for fire. And whenever I sold a poem, mine went there too, to fire. None of the older Negro intellectuals would have anything to do with fire. Dr. Dubois in The Crisis roasted it. The Negro press called it all sorts of bad names, largely because of a green and purple story by Bruce Nugent in the Oscar Wilde tradition, which we had included. Green Graves, the critic for the Baltimore Afro-American, began his review by saying, "I have just tossed the first issue of Fire into the fire." Commenting upon various of our contributors, he said, Aaron Douglas, who, in spite of himself and the meaningless grotesqueness of his creations, has gained a reputation as an artist, is permitted to spoil 3 perfectly good pages and a cover with his pen and ink hodgepodge. County Cullen has written a beautiful poem in his From a Dark Tower, but tries his best to obscure the thought in superfluous sentences. Langston Hughes displays his usual ability to say nothing in many words. So Fire had plenty of cold water thrown on it by the colored critics. The white critics, except for an excellent editorial in the Bookman for November 1926, scarcely noticed it at all. We had no way of getting it distributed to bookstands or newsstands. Bruce Nugent took it around New York on foot, and some of the Greenwich Village bookshops put it on display and sold it for us. But then Bruce, who had no job, would collect the money and, on account of salary, eat it up before he got back to Harlem. Finally, irony of ironies, several hundred copies of Fire were stored in the basement of an apartment where an actual fire occurred, and the bulk of the whole issue was burned up. Even after that, Thurman had to go on paying the printer. Now Fire is a collector's item, and very difficult to get, being mostly ashes." Unquote. As part of the Harlem Renaissance, there was also a rise of a certain style of preacher, a highly energetic, audience participation style preacher. One of the most notable of these preachers was Reverend George Wilson Beckton, who Langston would sometimes pop in and watch, mainly for the people watching, but also because Beckton had a jazz band play worship songs before his sermons, and Langston loved jazz. As Beckton grew in popularity, he started a magazine and bought some articles and poems from Langston so he could publish them. After he had bought a few, he offered Langston a job. Quote, "The Reverend Dr. Beckton told me he had been a student of behavioristic psychology for a long time. That was why he had his audience get up and down so much, to rest them and hold them longer at his services. And thus, I knew, he was able to take up more collections in one evening than if the people started to drift out early. He preferred to have them drift to the altar with a dime. He said he knew the effects of music and rhythm on the human emotions, for he had made a study of audiences and their reactions, and he knew how to handle them. Now he was looking for someone who was clever with the written word to do with people through the printed page what he could do with them in person. During his talk with me, never once did he mention God. In the quiet of his study, he talked business, God being, no doubt, for public consumption. Unquote. Langston would ultimately turn down the position, though he slightly regretted it, if only because he thought it would have been interesting to learn more about the man. Langston spends a good chunk of the Big C talking about who he met at various parties during the Renaissance, and I'm not going to go into really any of those. But a popular topic at those parties was New Mexico, as it was also in vogue at the time. Inspired by these discussions, Langston writes the poem A House in Taos. He submitted the poem to a Palms magazine contest and wins first prize in $150. After this, Langston received a lot of letters from New Mexico claiming that the house he described in the poem was their house, despite the fact that Langston had never been to New Mexico. Well, I said we weren't going to cover the parties. We're going to cover one party. And the one party we're going to cover that Langston attended was the Hamilton Club Lodge Ball. You see, at the same time that Harlem was popular, there was another fad sweeping the nation. Nicknamed the Pansy Craze today, during the 1920s and 30s, there was a swell of popularity in drag shows. The Hamilton Club Lodge Ball, which had been happening since at least 1869, saw its popularity boom. At its peak, there were thousands of people between the performers and the spectators. And while cross-dressing was still illegal in New York, police officers simply chose not to enforce the law, and they often worked with the ball to provide security and arrest troublemakers. And I'm not going to be the one to make the argument that the two are linked, but the mid-1920s were the Harlem Renaissance and the pansy craze. Right now, we're in the mid-2020s, and the two biggest pop culture things I hear discussed today are Kendrick Lamar, a black artist, and RuPaul's Drag Race, a drag show. Take of that what you will. In 1927, Langston publishes his second book of poems, Fine Clothes to the Jew. Langston later regrets the title as it was confusing and he received pushback from the Jewish community for calling his book that. The book in general was met with split reviews. White newspapers liked it, but black newspapers hated it. Langston attributed this to a general feeling among educated black people about only wanting portrayals of black people to be positive and idealistic. And this is understandable. After years of art and culture that mocked, diminished, and reviled black people, black intellectuals wanted books, especially by black artists, to portray black people at their best and most cultured. And because there is nothing new under the sun, we see this today in media criticisms. There is a push for more diversity in things like movies and TVs and games, but there's also pushback if these characters have even the slightest flaws. And to be clear, Langston completely understood the argument. However, he had only ever written about reality. And in reality, he didn't grow up with the best and the cultured. He grew up with the people he wrote about, the dregs of society. And when he got to spend time with the educated and cultured black people of D.C., he found them snobby and standoffish. Are you ready? Let's do the time warp again. Oh, we're back in 1925, baby. Langston meets Warren Cunny, a fellow poet, and Warren Cunny tells him of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, an all-black college. Langston had never heard of Lincoln before, but he is immediately interested. So Langston enrolls, joining college once again. This time around, Langston is a shockingly normal college student. He likes Lincoln, though he has some issues. His main issue being that Lincoln University was designed to train black leaders for the future. Despite that, all the faculty and all the board members of the school, aka the leaders of the school, were all white. Beyond that, he has some fairly standard descriptions of college. He likes some of his teachers, he dislikes others. He witnesses hazing of freshmen by older students. He joins a fraternity. He even takes his time to describe the snowball fights in the winter, the skating ponds, and the indoor basketball gym. Overall, Langston is having a much better time than he did in his 1 year at Columbia. In 1927, Langston is asked to speak at Fisk University and the YMCA conference in Texas during his summer break. So he travels first to Fisk and speaks at commencement. He describes it as one of the first times he got to stand in front of a large group of black people and read his poetry. And it feels twice as good when he realizes that the audience actually likes his poems. After giving the commencement at Fisk, he prepares to head to Texas, but he is informed that the conference has been canceled due to the Mississippi River flooding. He is paid a settlement by the YMCA regardless, and he uses that money to travel the South for the first time in his life. In terms of Langston facing the Jim Crow South for the first time, he finds it quite bad, but not as bad as it could have been, though he admits it would have likely been much worse in parts he didn't visit. At one point in his travels, Langston hears of black and white flood victims being held in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, so he makes the trip down. Now, I'm going to give you a long quote from the Big C here, but that's just because I want you to consider something. This was 62 years after slavery was abolished. You tell me if you can tell. Quote, in Baton Rouge, the Red Cross had housed the whites in a group of tree-shaded buildings that were former government barracks, I believe. The Negroes were housed in an open field in small tents where the mud was ankle-deep when it rained. The whites were given 3 hot meals a day, the Negroes 2. The whites received regular rations of tobacco, snuff, and candy. The Negroes got what was left over, if any, of those delicacies. The Negroes, some of them, had horrifying tales to tell of forced labor at the point of a gun on levees that finally gave way, of terrified whites fleeing in all the available boats and leaving their black workers to find the way to safety as best they could, of hair-raising nights on roofs or knolls or flood-surrounded portions of the levee, fighting back snakes and little wild animals that sought refuge there too. Most of the refugees could not read or write. Most of them had never seen a city before. Some of them had never been off the plantations where they were born. Some of them, grown, had never had $10 at once in their lives. But are you going back to the plantations? I would ask. The camp was guarded, and the Negroes would look at the guards. They had no money. They knew nowhere to go. They would generally say, yes, sir, I reckon we is. Baton Rouge depressed me terribly. So, having the money to go away, I went. I bought a ticket for New Orleans. The day before I left, I stayed at the colored refugee camp all day. Near sundown, I was sitting on a pile of dirt from the ditches of the improvised drainage system, talking to a field hand of perhaps 30, short, powerfully built, with a face dark as Africa. A little distance away, near one of the tents, his wife sat on a box playing with 3 small children. She was a good-looking brown-skinned girl in a blue-flowered dress. She's mighty proud of herself 'cause she's got one of them dresses out of the barrel that come this morning, the field hand said. It was not a bad dress to be from an old clothes barrel, and she looked good in it as she sat laughing with the young ones. Your kids? I asked, nodding toward the 3 children. Sure is, he said. All boys. 2 of the children were quite dark, but the skin on one of them was an ivory yellow, near white. A curious contrast, 2 dark, 1 light. A curious contrast, 2 dark, 1 light. I think he read my thoughts. One child truthfully ain't mine. Oh, I said. That little one yonder, the Maroney, belongs to the overseer, but I treats him like it's mine. Unquote. Done with the realities of Baton Rouge, Langston travels to New Orleans and rents a room there. His landlady would throw parties every Saturday, frying fish and playing jazz records on her Victrola. And if there's one thing Langston loves, it's these neighborhood get togethers with jazz music and food. One of the first things Langston notices about New Orleans is the plethora of drugstores and voodoo shops. One day, he enters one of those voodoo shops and buys something called wishing powder. Now, Langston is not that superstitious as we've seen, but he does wonder if the wishing powder worked because the very next day, he's walking along the docks when he discovers a ship called the Nardo, and the Nardo is heading to Havana. Realizing he had enough time to go to Havana and back and still have some more time in New Orleans before he had to return to college, Langston signs on as a mess boy. Langston quickly befriends the Chinese chefs, and once the ship reaches Havana, he goes around with them, visiting a very sad-looking brothel. Overall, Langston finds Havana quite hot, and before he knows it, he's back in New Orleans. While in New Orleans, he finds an unexpected friend, Zora Neale Hurston. The two were friends, having worked on things like Fire together, but neither knew the other one would be in New Orleans. Quote, Miss Hurston was bound north too. She had her own car, so we decided to travel together, stopping on the way to pick up folk songs, conjure, and big old lies. For Miss Hurston was on a collector's trip for one of the folklore societies. Blind guitar players, conjure men, and former slaves were her quarry. Small-town jukes and plantation churches her haunts. I knew it would be fun traveling with her. It was. We stopped at Tuskegee and made speeches on writing to the summer school students, which was our only contact with formal culture all the way from Mobile to New York. Then we went to Macon, Georgia, where Bessie Smith was singing in a small theater. But you didn't have to go near the theater to hear Bessie sing. You could hear her blocks away. Besides, she practiced every morning in the hotel where we lived, so we met her and got to know her pretty well. Bessie said, "The trouble with white folks singing blues is they can't get low down enough." Unquote. Now, I don't know about getting low down, but I've sang enough black spirituals with white folks to know that there's certainly something missing. Though I'm not sure I fully realized it until my freshman year of college, when I joined a predominantly black gospel choir. But we're not here for me. We're here for the road trip of Zora and Langston. Along the way, Zora's research project required them to meet with a number of what Langston calls conjurers and charlatans. Langston describes them meeting with a very famous conjurer in Georgia. Zora gives the conjurer a phony sob story about her sister back in Brooklyn, trying to keep her away from an inheritance, and asks the man to help. He does his thing, which impresses neither of them, then charges them 75 cents. Neither Zora nor Langston understand why this man was popular enough in Georgia to cause people to abandon their doctors for him. But given the world we live in, people abandoning science and medicine for charlatans and conjurers seems to be a recurring theme. Also in Georgia, Langston buys a straw hat. Shortly after he buys it, he meets an old man with an old hat. It was covered in patches and was old, and it felt like Georgia to Langston. So he traded the man his brand new hat for this Ship of Theseus-esque hat. Langston treasures it, taking it with him back to New York. In New York, he stores it in a safety deposit box with his manuscripts, wanting to protect it. When he returns to the safety deposit box months later, the box was full of moths who had completely eaten the hat. Back in New York, Langston's next year at college begins. He continues to do normal college things like working at the school paper, joining the school track team, and reading poems with the Glee Club. He also continues to do famous poet things like speak at an interracial YMCA conference. Langston had heard horror stories of interracial conferences, though the one he attends is relatively tame. But that's not to say Langston's experiences are all picturesque, though. Quote, "Once, at the Hill School, a fashionable boys' preparatory school in Pennsylvania, Elaine Locke and I were asked to appear on a morning program devoted to Negro literature. Afterwards, we were invited to luncheon. Later, I learned that the whole seating arrangement of the boys' dining hall had been disturbed, a special table allotted to us, and the boys asked to volunteer as to who would be willing to sit beside a Negro. Such a procedure seemed to me to be absolutely amazing, especially in the light of Dr. Locke's having represented the United States as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, his wide travel background, and his important contributions to American life. Unquote. Come the end of his junior year, Langston wants to write a novel. However, he's still pretty poor. He needs to work during the summer so he can afford tuition and whatnot. That's where the Sprigarns come in. Joel Sprigarn was one of the founders of the NAACP and later served as the president. Joel introduces Langston to a kind old woman, who Langston refuses to name but we now know is Charlotte Osgood Mason, a wealthy white woman who spent over $100,000 supporting artists like Elaine Locke, Aaron Douglas, Arthur Fawcett, Miguel Covarrubias, and Zora Neale Hurston during the Harlem Renaissance. The first time Langston meets her, she slips a $50 bill into his hand as he's leaving. Back at Lincoln, he writes her a thank you card for the money. She invites him back that winter, and while they're there, they talk. Langston likes her, and she seems to like him. She asks him what he wants to do. He tells her that he wants to write a novel. She nods and tells him to do it, agreeing to cover all of his expenses. Langston now has a patron. So, with his finances situated, he begins Not Without Laughter. The characters he uses for the novel are somewhat autobiographical, though he changes various things, feeling that his experience was both typical and not typical, and he wanted the novel to be about a typical family's experience. In the summer following his junior year, he's given special permission by the school to stay in his dorm. He spends the summer writing. Quote, "Then I began the second chapter. At first, I did a chapter or two a day and revisited them the next day. But they seemed bad. In fact, so bad I finally decided to write the whole story straight through to the end before rereading anything. This I did in about 6 weeks. Then I went to Provincetown for a vacation before classes opened in the fall." Unquote. And as anyone who's ever tried to write anything can tell you, this is a common experience. Writing and editing at the same time is not a sustainable habit and just makes you worse at both things. Creating a first draft and editing a draft are two different brain functions, or so I've been told, meaning it's very taxing to go from drafting to editing back to drafting. But with his first draft done, Langston spends his senior year reworking and editing the novel. And again, after the year is over, he is given special permission to stay in his dorm to finish editing and polishing the novel. Finally, Langston is happy with it, and he takes a vacation to Canada. And when he returns to New York, he hates it again. So he moves to New Jersey now that he's done with college, and he works on editing it again, this time working with typist Louise Thompson. Eventually, Langston got it published and out there. And Langston had wanted the novel to be wonderful. He had spent years with these characters, but he never felt like he fully did them justice. A feeling I often have working on this show. And while Not Without Laughter was his writer project, Langston had one other notable senior year project I want to talk about. For his sociology class, he was asked to present a paper on a phase of American life. Langston chooses to do a survey across campus. His paper, he decides, will be on the race line between students and teachers. The results of his survey don't surprise Langston. 63% of juniors and seniors are happy that they have an all-white faculty. Quote, 63% of the members of the upper classes favor for their college a faculty on which there are no Negro professors. And since I have never heard otherwise, I judge that the faculty of Lincoln University itself supports the attitude. Yet it seems to me the height of absurdity for an institution designed for the training of Negro leadership to support and uphold, on its own grounds, the unfair and discriminatory practices of the American color line. And the fact that 81 members of the senior and junior classes at this college can themselves approve of such a situation and give reasons for their approval which express open belief in their own inferiority indicates that the college itself has failed in instilling in these students the very quality of self-reliance and self-respect which any capable American leader should have. And the purpose of this college, let us remember, is to educate leaders of the colored people. There is a mixed faculty at Fisk, and certainly the work done there is quite on par with Lincoln. Tuskegee has an all-Negro faculty, as have many other schools dependent on white philanthropy, and certainly with men like Charles S. Johnson, Wesley, Locke, Brady, and Just in the teaching fields, besides large number of colored graduates every year from the best northern universities, it is stupid to say that there are no capable Negro teachers available. Not an all-Negro faculty, possibly not even a predominantly colored faculty is to be desired. But certainly one of our 11 professors might well belong to the race from which all of the 323 resident students of this institution come." Unquote. Langston's paper gets some media attention, which he says distorts the facts and arguments he was making, and at graduation, Langston is accosted by a former graduate of Lincoln who chastises Langston. This graduate is a successful business owner and is doing good work for the black community he's in. His message to Langston is boiled down to, quote, "Things are got out of white folks by flattery, cajolery, good-natured begging, lying, and general Uncle Tomming, not by the truth." Unquote. This unsettles Langston. He feels, quote, "bad, confused, puzzled. I had never thought much before about the nature of compromise. For bread, how much of the spirit must one give away?" He had his great buildings, serving hundreds of black people denied the same service elsewhere in the city where he lived. And maybe those buildings would stand there a long time on their cornerstone of lies. I began to think back to Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, John Brown, Fred Douglass, folks who left no buildings behind them, only a wind of words fanning the bright flame of the spirit down the dark lanes of time. The old grad has his buildings, just as Booker T. Washington had Tuskegee. Yet how heavily the bricks of compromise settle into place. But Lincoln today is not the Lincoln of my survey. In 10 brief years, many changes have been made. There are Negro members of both the faculty and the Board of Trustees. It is a mixed faculty now, Negro and white, which is the way it seems to me all the faculties of all the universities of America should be. Unquote. Freshly graduated, Langston moves to New Jersey to finish his novel, as we talked about. He continues to receive a monthly allowance from Charlotte and is given luxuries he couldn't have otherwise dreamed of. Working with typist Louise Thompson, for example, is only possible because of Charlotte. In addition to Not Without Laughter, Langston writes his first play, Mulatto, during his first year out of college. As we talked about, Langston really likes his patron. She is roughly the age his grandmother would have been if she had been alive, but Langston notes how sharp she is, remembering every detail of every day and keeping up on modern culture. And because of her, Langston describes his first post-college year as rapturous. Quote, "Out of a past of more or less continued insecurity and fear, suddenly I found myself with an assured income from someone who loved and believed in me. An apartment in a suburban village for my work. My brother in school in New England and no longer a financial difficulty to my mother. Myself with boxes of fine bond paper for writing, a filing case, a typist to copy my work, and wonderful new suits of dinner clothes from Fifth Avenue shops, and a chance to go to all the theaters and operas and lectures, no matter how expensive or difficult securing tickets might be. All I needed to say was when and where I wished to go, and my patron secretary would have tickets for me. That season, I went to the Metropolitan, to concerts at Carnegie Hall, to the hit plays and latest musicals, often with my patron. Together we heard Sadko, saw the first Little Show, Berkeley Square, and Blackbirds. We heard Madame Naidu speak, and General Smuts. We saw the Van Goghs. We drove through Central Park in the spring to see the first leaves come out. It was all very wonderful. Park Avenue, and Broadway, and Harlem, and New York. Unquote. After finishing his novel, Langston decides to take a break. He's happy, financially secure, and tired, a combination that has historically led to no writing. Especially with Langston, as he often mentions that he does not write when he's happy. He writes when he's sad, when he's bored, or when he feels like he needs to say something. Charlotte, his patron, begins to be increasingly displeased with this idleness. And around this time, Zora Neale Hurston comes to stay near Langston, and the two start to work on a project. Quote, during the winter, Zora Hurston came to Westfield from one of her many trips into the Deep South, and there began to arrange her folk material, stacks and stacks of it, some of which later appeared in Mules and Men. Together, we also began to work on a play called Mulebone, a Negro folk comedy, based on an amusing tale Miss Hurston had collected about a quarrel between two rival church factions. I plotted out and typed the play based on her story, while she authenticated and flavored the dialogue and added highly humorous details. We finished a first draft before she went south again, and from this draft I was to work out a final version. Zora, a very gay and lively girl, was seriously hemmed in a village like Westfield, but those backing her folklore project felt that she should remain quietly in a small town and not go gallivanting gaily about New York while engaged in the serious task of preparing her manuscripts. So she was restless and moody, working in a nervous manner, and we were both distressed at the growing depression, hearing of more and more friends and relatives losing jobs and becoming desperate for lack of work. Unquote. Mulebone, as Langston mentions, is not finished before the two separate. Also around this time, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel opens, which infuriates Langston. The Waldorf Astoria was a very ritzy hotel. It bothered Langston that a luxury hotel would open during a period of time where so many people were homeless, as this is 1931. The Great Depression is in full swing. This gives Langston something he feels he needs to say, so he writes. He writes a piece sarcastically mocking the Waldorf Astoria's advertisements. His benefactor reads the piece, but she is disappointed. She calls it powerful, but not like Langston. She's displeased at his idleness, and now she's displeased with his work. Things are headed towards their inevitable end, but first, Langston goes to Cuba again. He really wants to write an opera, and he's looking for a composer to work with. The composers in New York either don't fit or they're too busy, but he gets a tip about a man in Cuba. Langston has a great time, but he returns with no composer. And so, one day, it all came to a head, and Langston realized the truth of his patron. She was, for lack of a better word, a fetishist. She had pumped a tremendous amount of money into Harlem Artist, but it was because she liked a certain kind of art. Art that was primitive and reduced all black people to a primitive state. Quote, she wanted me to be primitive and know and feel the intuitions of the primitive. But unfortunately, I did not feel the rhythms of the primitive surging through me, and so I could not live and write as though I did. I was only an American Negro who had loved the surface of Africa and the rhythms of Africa, but I was not Africa. I was Chicago and Kansas City and Broadway and Harlem, and I was not what she wanted me to be. So in the end, it all came back very near to the old impasse of white and Negro again. White and Negro, as do most relationships in America. Unquote. Langston describes his final conversation with his patron as similar to the night he realized he hated his father. During his first trip to Mexico, Langston realizes one morning that he hated his father, causing him to be ill and feverish. He spent weeks in a Mexican hospital with a mysterious illness that no one could diagnose. The night he breaks things off with his patron, he feels like he did all those years ago. Over the next few weeks, he goes from doctor to doctor, who diagnose him with anything from a rare Japanese tapeworm to tonsillitis. Given modern context, and I'm not a doctor, but I do know that things like anxiety and depression can cause gut issues. The way Langston talks about it feels very much like something like that. Cut off and broke, Langston goes to Chicago to live with his mother and stepfather. In Chicago, he goes to see a play. Afterwards, talking with the local theater troupe, they tell him something interesting. The next play they're going to stage was from Zora Neale Hurston. It was a little play called Mulebone. Langston is furious, as he and Zora had never finished Mulebone, and now she was trying to get it made without him. Over the next few weeks, Zora comes to Chicago and they have a series of discussions and fights. The way Langston describes it, it sounds almost like an ex-lover's spat, which is interesting given the modern questions about Langston Hughes' sexuality. But regardless of the true reason behind the fight, it blows up the production of Mulebone, which is never finished. This is also the last time we know of that Langston and Zora would talk. Mulebone was staged for the first time in the 1990s, long after Zora and Langston were dead. It was a flop. 1931 also sees Not Without Laughter finally hit shelves. It wins the 1931 Harmon Gold Award for Literature, which nets Langston $400. He takes the money and goes to Haiti. He needed a break. Quote, "Up to the time I received the 1931 Harmon Award, I had never had that much money of my own at once in all my life. $400. I had never had a job that paid more than $22 a week, nor had I sold any of my poems or articles for more than $75, the top price paid once for a group of poems. Mostly, I had received no income at all from my poetry, since I gratefully gave it away to anybody who would publish it, and very little from the few stories or articles I had written. My novel had just come out. My 2 books of poems had both gone beyond the first edition, but had by no means been bestsellers. So as of yet, the big editors did not know my name, or gave no sign of knowing it, and my play, Mulatto, was unproduced. Nevertheless, I had finally and definitely made up my mind to continue being a writer, and to become a professional writer, making my living from writing. So far that had not happened. Until I went to Lincoln, I had always worked at other things. Teaching English in Mexico, truck gardening on Staten Island, a seaman, a doorman, a cook, a waiter in Paris nightclubs or in hotels and restaurants, a clerk at the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, a busboy at the Wardman Park in Washington. Then I'd had a scholarship, a few literary awards, a patron, but those things were ended now. I would have to make my own living again, so I determined to make it writing. I did. Shortly, poetry became bread, prose, shelter, and raiment. Words turned into songs, plays, scenarios, articles, and stories. Unquote. And so ends the Harlem Renaissance, the Big C, and most of what I wanted to share with you about Langston Hughes. From here on out, we'll run through the latter half of Langston's life quite quickly. In 1931, he founds the New York Suitcase Theater, and he also starts working with Prentice Taylor, a popular illustrator. The two make books and pamphlets with Langston writing and Prentice arting. In 1932, Langston and a group of Harlem artists head to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wants to make a propaganda film about the reality of life for black people in America as punishment for the US not acknowledging their government. The film is ultimately never made, as the US establishes an embassy and acknowledges the Soviet government before the film is finished. Langston visits China and Japan while he's on that side of the world, though. In 1934, Langston writes The Ways of White Folks, his first collection of short stories. Noel Sullivan offers him a cottage in California for a year as he writes it. And while he was in California, he joins the board of the San Francisco Workers' School. In 1935, Langston receives a Guggenheim Fellowship. Around that time, he co-writes the screenplay for Way Down South with Clarence Muse, who acts in it. This is Langston's first, and I think only screenwriting credit, though not by choice. He wanted to write more films, but he always felt he was blacklisted for racial reasons. In 1937, Langston once again works at a newspaper. He becomes a war correspondent for the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper and heads to Spain to cover the Spanish Civil War. Langston supports the Communist Republican faction, and his poems were translated and published in a Spanish magazine. The pen is not mightier than the sword, however, as the Republicans would lose to the Nationalists. Langston also writes a poem in support of China when they are invaded by the Japanese around this time. In 1941, back in America, Langston founds the Skyloft Players in Chicago, a theater group which wanted to nurture and promote black playwrights. Around this time, he also starts writing a column for the Chicago Defender, a column he would write for about 20 years. And while he starts off opposing World War II, he eventually supports it, believing that black involvement in the war effort could help the civil rights movement. And the Langston Hughes of the 50s and 60s begins to fade out of mainstream popularity. The racial question was coming to a head yet again, and movements like the Black Power movement didn't feel that Langston Hughes was aggressive enough, which Langston somewhat agreed with, feeling that anger wasn't the way. And in 1967, Langston passes away due to complications from a surgery related to his prostate cancer. He was 66 years old. And so ends Langston Hughes. In my mind, Langston Hughes is the quintessential American writer. Him and Mark Twain. Langston succeeded as a writer because he looked at America and wrote about America, not the idealistic version it could be, but as it actually was. One of the most interesting things doing the research for this was looking at Langston's political views. I learned about Langston Hughes in high school and college, but at no point did anyone mention his strong ties to socialism. It feels like a Martin Luther King Jr. thing where people wipe away the radical social views of these black icons so they're more palatable for a mainstream audience. And it's not like it was a secret. In 1953, he was called before Senator Joe McCarthy and accused of being a communist. But if you look at Langston's life for about 5 minutes, it makes sense. Why would he support capitalism? He had no capital. He was poor and discriminated against. Of course he'd support an overhaul of the system. And to be fair, while he certainly leaned heavily socialist as a young man, he toned it down a lot as he got older. Whether that was a change in views, hurt over the Soviet Union rug-pulling his film, or the fact that Langston Hughes was America, and in the latter parts of his life, America was in a Cold War with socialism. As one final parting gift, I'll leave you with my favorite Langston Hughes poem, Let America Be America Again, a poem as relevant today as it was in 1937 when he wrote it. Quote, "Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love, where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. it was never America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek, and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man, full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today despite the dream. Beaten yet today, oh pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead. The poorest worker bartered through the years. Yet I'm the one who dreamt our basic dream. In the old world, while still a serf of kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings. And every brick and stone and every furrow turned, that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I'm the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I'm the one who left dark Ireland's shore, and Poland's plain, and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's strand I came, to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay, except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. For those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again. America! Oh, yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath. America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Unquote. I love that poem. I just wish it didn't have to keep being relevant. But as I mentioned last time, Langston Hughes is the final person on my list of writers I for sure am going to cover. So if you've got a suggestion for a writer for me to cover, let me know. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryofStoryTLR, or if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. I'm also on Blue Sky at StoryofStoryTLR. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goofs, Soupy Twists.